Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
Hey, welcome to Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast. I am one of your hosts, Kollibri.
I'm Nikki Hill.
One of the other hosts. And today we're joined by Calyx Liddick. And I first heard an interview with Calyx on Kelly Moody's podcast, the Ground Shots podcast, last summer, and it totally blew me away. I was on the road at that time, and I can still remember the piece of Utah highway I was on when I listened to it, because it made such an impression on me. And so I'm thrilled that Calyx is joining us today for what's going to be a very interesting conversation, I'm sure. Calyx, do you want to tell us, say hi and say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I've been, like I said before, I've been following both of you guys for a while, following your work. So really excited to be here and to have this conversation. I'm Calyx. I'm an herbalist. I'm a clinical herbalist, nutritionist, and I run a school here in South Central Pennsylvania with my partner. I always struggle with like self-introductions because I feel like I've been morphing and changing my identity and the work that I do over the years so much. But I think the crux of it is that I like to explore relationships with plants and people. I like to think about how people learn about plants, how they interrelate with plants. And I'm especially interested in the mismanaged relationships and the relationships that that we have with plants that are not so healthy. So I love learning about herbs and all of the culturally important plants, of historical times and of the modern era. But I really have a soft spot for those plants that we don't culturally value. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the past few years and has really started to change the way that I work and teach and do things. That's a little bit about me. I'm a mom. I have 2 kids. So I think this particular conversation that we're going to jump into today is really coming at the perfect time because it's really a big part of my work at this point. So, yeah.
And what's the name of your school?
The Northern Appalachia School.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you started that, and you're an instructor.
Yeah. My partner and I started the school during COVID lockdown. We had started some ideas and we're planning on launching, and right around the time that we were ready to launch, COVID happened. So it's been an interesting journey. But yeah, I run an herbalism program, a bioregional herbalism program every year, and get to work with some really amazing students. And then we do some different workshops. My partner teaches a slightly different skill set than me, but some overlap, but he teaches more like wildlife tracking and things like that. So overlapping skills for sure. But so it's been a fun ride these past couple years. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, plant movement, animal movement, it all goes together. It's all related. Right. And well, if you're tracking bears, you're going to find berries and et cetera. Yeah. So yeah. I wanted to start off with from your interview with Kelly, one of the things that you said that really made me sit up straight was that you said that you were talking about the overlap and the connection between the conservation movement and historically the eugenics movement. Mm-hmm. And you said that eugenics was conservation as applied to humans. Mm-hmm. And that I was just like, whoa, okay, mind blown. And part of this story was someone named Madison Grant. So mm-hmm. I just wanted to throw those 2 things out there as kind of a starting point, if you think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, so that's something that coming from it from a perspective of conservation. So I didn't really know anything about eugenics up until a handful of years ago. It's not something that most of us are taught about. I think there's reasons for that, but so coming from it from the perspective of that, and then so essentially I got interested in eugenics after reading about how some of the players in the conservation movement also existed in the eugenics movement. And I thought that that was interesting, that there was overlap. And at the time, I thought, well, maybe a product of the times. And I had just no idea how deep that rabbit hole was going to go when I started this research. So I think, I've come to the conclusion now after diving into different writings and trying to understand the frame of mind that both of these movements came from, and specifically trying to understand where the eugenics movement came from in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's now clear to me that, like, if you actually look into the history of these topics, it's blatant. Like, I mean, I actually have some quotes. I can look through my notes and try to find some here but basically the players in the conservation movement you can consistently find them across the board, conservation and eugenics. They were all the same people. It was an interlocking directorate of people in both of those movements. And they came out right out and said this, that they were the same movement. Madison Grant is the one that I'm the most interested in studying, because he was essentially the one that I wouldn't say that he invented scientific racism, but he did bring all of the pieces together and present it in a scientific way. But it's not just Madison Grant, it's across the board. There's so many different conservationists who were at the forefront of the eugenics movement, and how they actually came right out and said, that that's what they were doing, that they were applying their background in wildlife management and zoology, and applying it anthropologically, applying it to humans. I mean, like I said, I have a number of quotes. So it's not just me, making assumptions about that. They came right out and said it on numerous occasions. Yeah, so I think they're the same. They have the same roots. They come from a lot of the same mentalities, the same kind of creed. And yeah, definitely. It's not just an overlap. They actually have the same root.
Right. And just to be clear, to take a critical look at conservationism as a movement, and to look at its history, and to look at some of the things that drive it, is not at all to say that there are not places that need to be protected, and that there are not things that need to be saved, or anything like that. So that's not the point of this conversation, is not to say that it should just be a free-for-all where we cut down all the trees and mine all the mountains. That's not the point of this either. It's more to point out how the priorities of those, how the overlapping priorities of conservationism and eugenics has led to some ideas that are still with us that are actually not helpful for protecting and saving different natural places and natural processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many examples of that, right? I mean, we can take examples from history, we can take examples that are happening today. But even just looking at, like, Yosemite and what happened there, I frequently think about like what might have happened if the people who were involved in early conservation movements were not racist, were not white nationalists. How might things have been different? Would they have been able to have opened their minds to Indigenous stewardship that was happening? Right. And this pattern is still happening all over the world. We still have conservation refugees being currently, created all over the planet still, because of that superiority mindset. So yeah, definitely not to say that we don't. Of course, I'm a huge advocate for, like, protecting spaces and tending spaces, but I think that conservation, because of the fact that it's born of the same perspectives, the same flawed perspectives, we really need to have more conversations about how that has played out into the conservation movement, and where maybe we've made some wrong turns and we're continuing to repeat mistakes that we're part of the foundation of it. So definitely think that we need to be dissecting this movement more than we have been, and doing it unapologetically.
Right, right. And I expect this conversation to take us around to invasive plants in particular. But maybe you could walk us through some of the history. For example, the Boon and Crockett Club and Madison Grant and some of these people, and just show us the connections that existed then.
So the Boon and Crockett Club was created as a so it was created as a hunting club, a socialite hunting club. And it was created by Teddy Roosevelt and a handful of other wealthy white male patricians. And the idea was, so hunting back in this point in time, I forget the year that it was founded, but it was in the early 1900s, right? Hunting was a really, really important aspect to maintaining status. So it was a really important part of that culture to do big game hunting and things like that. And the Boon and Crockett Club was created as an outlet for for them to share their stories and share their passion for hunting. But it was the idea was that I forget the exact quote of when it was founded, but one of Teddy Roosevelt's missions for that club was to promote like the manliest sport, right? It was supposed to be the most rigorous, manliest sport. And so it started off that way, and eventually through the influence of a few of the members, primarily from my understanding, it seems like Madison Grant was one of the main members that pushed the Boon and Crockett Club beyond that scope into the scope of being a conservation organization. And from the research that I've done, I always believe that, like the Sierra Club and a couple other organizations were the early conservation organizations of this country. But it seems to me that the Boon and Crockett Club was actually the first organized thing that was going on, trying to work on conservation issues. So it morphed from one thing into several. It went through several different phases as the conservation movement changed, and as different branches of conservation kind of came about. And Madison Grant was one of, like I said, one of the big influencers. So kind of wherever Madison Grant went, it seemed like the Boon and Crockett Club kind of followed. Even if other members kind of branched off into different aspects of conservation. So it branched into this conservation organization because it kind of morphed into that because there became a concern that what's going to happen if we don't preserve all these animals that we can hunt, right? What happens if they disappear? And if they disappear, then we lose our ability to maintain our status through this activity. So it was definitely a very self-centered perspective. But again, as the conservation movement changed, some of those actors started to consider things more from a preservationist aspect, more from different aspects as far as beyond just we want to be able to hunt animals, but also we want to protect the landscape. We want to protect, old America as they saw it. And that also plays into this whole culture around eugenics, and in the fact that what they were trying to preserve and I believe this actually, there was a statement that came directly from Madison Grant to George Bird Grinnell, where he actually said that's what this is about, what both movements are about, is that they're about preserving old America. And so we can see those patterns play out in conservation. We can see those patterns play out as far as trying to maintain the landscape of old America, meaning the America that existed prior to large immigration, but after the genocide of Indigenous people, right? So that sweet spot, right, that everybody wanted at the time, all those white nationalists wanted, and idealized. And then, we also see that from the human perspective of we want just that the nativist perspective, that nativism meaning that they not native as in Indigenous Americans, but as in the old stock, early colonial Americans, right? So we wanted to preserve that as well as part of the old America. And so there was a big fear around immigration and the changes that were happening in those couple of decades as we saw mass influxes of immigration from different parts of the world, particularly Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. So the Boon and Crockett Club had lots and lots of different members, and if you look at the rosters for like the Boon and Crockett Club and all of the other conservation organizations that came about over the next like 2 decades in the U.S., there you see a lot of the same people. And a lot of those, like I said earlier, a lot of those same people are also on the roster for the American Eugenics Society and for all of the other organizations that came about around eugenics. So yeah, same people, same ideas. And from there, we see those people that were in the Boon and Crockett Club, we start to see them populate these other organizations and create them. The list of organizations that Madison Grant participated in is really long. I have it somewhere. It's very long, but he had his hands in virtually all of them. Yeah.
I think maybe some people haven't heard of the American Eugenics Society.
So maybe I should just start by defining like eugenics.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe we should just start there, so
Let's
in case people don't actually know what that even is. Eugenics has been around for a really long time, right? At least since Sparta, right? That was something that was practiced. It's been practiced for a long time, and it's a global phenomena. But particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, eugenics was part of the big part of the culture in America, and it's what largely influenced Nazi Germany. Okay, so eugenics is this concept. Well, it's racial hygiene. And eugenics in the early American eugenics movement was based on this concept that a particular white race, so that they called them the Nordics or the Aryans or the Teutons, the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, they all for that Northern white European, and the belief was that they were genetically superior. Okay, and it was an interesting time because you have Darwin had just released The Origin of the Species. We have Gregor Mendel is just coming out with these new ideas from his studies about how genetics are passed down. And so those two kind of new blossoming scientific movements were kind of hijacked to support racism and to give it what appeared to be a scientific basis. So eugenics was really about, and is still today about, how do we maintain racial purity, and how do we prevent mixing of what were considered inferior races with a superior Nordic race, or in the extreme case of like how do we actually exterminate those people or completely segregate them from our political boundaries, right? Like was done in Germany. So that's kind of, that was what was happening. That was the movement, and it wasn't a small movement. It was very much status quo. It was part of the big part of the culture, and there was a fear among the elite class, which primarily because of the way that class warfare often works out. The elite class were those, white Nordic wealthy males that were kind of ruling everything, running everything. There was a huge fear that they were going to become, their race was going to become diluted and deteriorate. And so eugenics came about as a way of maintaining that racial purity. And so we see a lot of different organizations and political movements and things that came up as an effort to organize around this and actually create policy change. And so the American Eugenics Society Association was was a product of that, but it wasn't the only one. We also have, like, actually the Carnegie genetics department actually originated from this basically was this records office that was developed from I believe it was Rockefeller money that funded this. One of those the big bankers funded this this office. It was basically to gather surveys from people to try to prove that these things were being genetically handed down. So when we say genetic inheritance, we're not just talking about physical genetic inheritance. We're talking about there was this idea that intelligence was handed down genetically, that talent, that criminality, and then all kinds of physical things could be handed down through your genes. So it was like, what I find interesting is the level of fear and like terror that these people seem to be experiencing. Like, if you read accounts and quotes from eugenicists, they were actually as afraid of racial extinction. And you could liken that to how people like you and I maybe feel today about the extinction of species around the globe, and like what that means for our outlook as humans, and also just as a global, society. So I think, yeah, this fear of extinction is what kind of started that. And then so the actual organization had, like I said, there were a lot of different conservation members that were a part of it, but also people like John Harvey Kellogg and Luther Burbank, and lots of different politicians and scientists and doctors, really profoundly influential people were part of that. And you see that, we saw that here in the United States. We also saw that in Germany in the Nuremberg trials, because every single one of the scientists and doctors that were put on trial all pleaded not guilty. Right? They truly believed that they were acting in a way that would protect what they perceived to be their people, right? So that was the perspective at least that was the perspective of, like I said, the elite class. The thing was that the modern or the average person of that time that wasn't part of the elite class didn't necessarily care too much about any of this stuff. So what these eugenics organizations and the policymakers were trying to do was they were trying to propagandize and change the opinion of the American people to scare them into thinking that they needed to be, careful about racial mixing and needed to preserve themselves if they were of this supposed Nordic race.
Right.
Yeah.
And if any of this sounds familiar to people listening now, it's because some of these ideas are still out there. I mean, replacement theory or great replacement theory, that the big one that's being pushed the last few years, that, white America is going to be overcome, by immigrants. I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing. It
is the same. There was so Jeff Sessions just a couple of years ago made that statement about the 1924 Immigration Act, saying that this has happened once before, and that's when the Immigration Restriction Act was put into place, and it really he was kind of acting like it really solved things for us. The Immigration Restriction Act was put into place literally because scientific racism had momentum. And Madison Grant didn't write that bill, but he was credited with all of the foundation that they needed to make that pass. And the Immigration Restriction Act prevented all Asians, and it limited Southern and Eastern Europeans from immigrating. So it was a huge, and we haven't really recovered from that since then. I mean, immigration to the US has always been altered since then. It's never been anything close to what it was before that. So we have modern politicians today still saying that we need to follow what they did back in the 1920s to prevent this immigration catastrophe that's happening, because we're still, it's still that mindset of fear, right? Of not just immigration, but specifically of immigration from certain types of people, and specifically non-white, non-English speaking people. So yeah, and I mean, there's plenty of evidence all around that we know the white supremacy is still rampant, and we know we can see it in every day in the way that policy making, but also like where I live in a very conservative area. The interactions that I have on a daily basis have confirmed for me that this is still a huge problem. And that, so just a perfect evidence of like these politicians are actually basing their decisions on these exact same laws that were put into place that were horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So kind of to sum up, eugenics as a philosophy or a movement was behind several things that happened. And among those things were limiting immigration, were segregation, keeping people separate. So the whole set of Jim Crow laws, and then I know that there was forced sterilization that happened also of people not considered to be of the proper race, and then Germany sort of picked up on all of this and took it to the extreme that they did, which is actually just exterminating people openly. Although extermination has happened here in the United States, as well, obviously. Right. And when you were talking to Kelly, you talked about 3 tenets of conservation that are shared as tenets of eugenics. And those 3 tenets were typology, deterioration, and invasive species.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the three tenets, those came, my understanding is came directly from Madison Grant. Okay. So typology, again, so it's this idea that within a species, there are different types of people or different types of mammals or different types of plants, and some of which are robust and healthy and intelligent or superior in some way, and others may be different or less so. And so when applied to people, this is scientific racism. Okay, so when we apply this to people, that's what that is. That's what it comes from. And so with human beings, they were measuring. They were doing actual measurements of people, of their bodies, to figure out what type they fit into. And then they were also basing it on, a history of, do they have a lot of talent in their ancestral lineage? What is their intelligence level? The IQ test has a pretty interesting and dark history, and was used to measure intelligence and for this typology purpose to be able to figure out where a person fits, because sometimes it's difficult, right? Because race doesn't totally, it doesn't actually exist. But anyway, so back to the conservation tenets. You can start to see it's not an imaginary overlap, right? I mean, like they're exactly identical in so many different ways, eugenics and conservation, because like I said, they're literally taking the education. These people were literally taking the education that they had and their observations and the work that they were doing around specifically primarily wildlife management, but also things like plant cultivation, and applying that directly to humans. And then they came up with these tenets. Yeah.
Right. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's just amazing to really fully understand that we shape our concepts about ourselves, our societies, and our world, the rest of the natural world, from a certain perspective. Mm-hmm. that it doesn't happen in a box,
right?
That where we decide what our science means comes from the way in which we've been looking at it. And it's just occurring to me more and more as time goes on, looking at these subjects for so long, that we're going to treat the world around us how we treat ourselves and each other. Like those things don't happen on their own. And something that was occurring to me in listening to you giving the history of human eugenics, and well, a couple of things came up. One was that that our idea of conservation today kind of takes humans out of the picture, sometimes with very violent upheaval and displacement of the people who are living there in those places. And so it's this idea of removal of humans, but the basis for conservation came from certain humans using that place for wildlife. So it's kind of this like double standard that's been there since the beginning too. And the other part was that a lot of the conservation stuff now is trying to go back to that sweet spot. And I've thought about it before, that a part of why that sweet spot holds a lot of pull for people is there's a sense of guilt that like, wow, there was a lot of genocide and disruption to Indigenous folks here. And there's a certain feeling in people that they'd like to put it back how it was, you know, to pay respect to how something was. But it's a funny one, because there's also that other aspect of when conservation was born, it was a place of, well, a colonized idea of old America, not a new one, you know? So that one's even flawed, even trying to come from a like heartfelt place of like feeling all the grief of all the shit that's happened. You know, it's like, that's still maybe the wrong placement, you know, for those things. And I'm sure we'll get into this more, but this stuff is also heavy. Like I feel that a lot. It was just like, we have to change the way we look at how we relate with the world and with each other. You know, it really is all relational, and you know, the typology, the deterioration, and the invasive species is all, those things only hold up from removal from relationship with the things around it. Otherwise, they don't make any sense. Like you have to throw out the process of evolution itself in order to have those tenets hold up. You know, like the process of remembering that we came up with the idea of a species, you know, but the process of speciation would be, you know, a pool of genetics in a certain environment responding and expressing in response to that environment over time. And then you have seed banks laid down, and you have certain seeds that can germinate because conditions were just right. And so those ones lay down another layer, and then conditions change. And then there's, you know, we don't actually understand that much about seed banks, you know, referring to plants, but like, and then they get isolated, and then you start to have different species who are expressing uniquely to that place over time. But at a certain point, different disturbances or movements happen. And then it's the divergent evolution again, which like reinvigorates it. Like when we were, you know, farming was the land race thing. How do you reinvigorate something that's gotten too small to be able to have all the expressions it might need, you know? So those are all like, I guess, just aspects of why I feel like these subjects are so important. You know, you can choose it from the human perspective, or from a plant perspective, or a wildlife biology perspective, and be like, we have to reconsider how the shape of how we're looking at things. Because we might be shooting the whole process of adaptability when we really need it.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about where do we draw the line, right, between, like, because I'm definitely of the opinion that plants are people, you know, and so where do we draw the line as far as if we're going to apply certain methods for working with plants and tending plants and cultivating them. And I think that's where the eugenics mindset came from, was like, well, if we're going to apply that to plants, then why not apply it to people? And we need to figure out where we draw the line. But even more than that, we need to figure out, like, where did we go? We have to go back farther than that and go, where did we go wrong? And it is 100%, I think it comes down to the relationship that we're having with the plants. And part of the reason why I find that all this stuff fascinating, but the reason I'm so interested in this and why it's pulled me in so hard is because it's at the root of this is why we have such problems with empathy in this culture. And I really want to be able to understand how to undo the damage of the perspectives that inform our day-to-day relations and also our science. Because if we're coming at this from like this perspective, like you said, that we're totally objective and the science is perfect and clean and good, like if you are not informing that with an understanding that we're all humans, it's all informed by the perspective that's been laid out for us. And we have to be able to pull ourselves outside of that to see the bigger picture of what's going on. So if we're just barreling down the line on this course that's been set out for us and saying, we know this science is good because we're doing science the way that science is supposed to be done, and not realizing the impacts of the culture that has come before us and that still exists today, and how that's impacting and the research that's being done. That's a huge problem. But also just like, the day-to-day relationships between people and people and plants and, animals, and the whole thing, the whole dynamic. So I think that's why I'm so stuck on this topic, because I just feel like if I can understand this and understand not just, I've gotten past the point of being angry about it. There's a lot of grief and, like you said, heaviness that goes into this, and into trying to actually empathize and understand the people, as I perceive them, as on the other side of like, how could you possibly do something so horrific and have such horrific beliefs? What's actually underneath that? Because if we can understand that and actually empathize with that, doesn't mean we have to say that it's okay or say that it wasn't totally messed up. But actually, what is underneath that? What are people so afraid of? Because I think a lot of this stuff comes from fear. I think all of this hatred and ugliness that we see politically happening, and culturally happening all around us all the time, a lot of it comes from fear. Trying to understand that. And then, like you said, also like this complete misunderstanding of what the landscape should look like, did look like, we're completely oblivious to, so many of us are completely oblivious to what the possibilities of what that could even be. We come into conservation with this mindset that we know exactly what the landscape should look like because it looked like that at a particular time. And now there's so much information out there now about how wrong that is. And yet we haven't backtracked and said, okay, well, maybe we should figure out how we can change course. We're still barreling down that path. So even with the information available, we're still saying that, that we need to preserve or return an ecosystem to its baseline when we're so far off the mark of what that baseline was. That's not even getting into the conversation yet about how baselines change. And that's the whole, like, ecology is a dynamic system, and plants move around, people move around, we're so afraid, again, it's that fear again, we're so afraid of change that we can't even see the fact that it's literally what makes life possible. I do think that talking about that, like the more information that people can come to receive, the information about the fact that our baseline is off. That was one of the things for me that just kind of turned everything upside down, was like, okay, well, if we don't even actually know what things look like, or they're way different than what we thought they looked like, then how can we even do right action? Like, how can we even make the right decisions about how to turn a landscape into something, whatever this idea of what it should be? You can't Can we, I think one of the problems that we have in our particular culture, at least in the US, I don't know about other parts of the world, but is that we are so quick to action without receiving information and observing. We're so like, we want to get things done, and like I said, I often think about what would happen if John Muir wasn't racist and he came here and he was able to have his eyes open and see what was happening in Yosemite and go, man, these people are right on with their land management. Look at this beautiful landscape, and receive that information. What could possibly have happened? And then that's kind of like my vision for the future of like, how can we do that now? How can we get to the point where we can actually be open and receive things beyond? How do we open up, move even farther past our comfort zone and past our, like, open our periphery even farther than we think is possible? So understanding the blinders and like how they get put on and how this stuff manifests and where it starts from, I think is an important part of that, of like starting from there and then trying to figure out, okay, now how do we move past that? Yeah.
I think a part of it that's been coming up for me is that somewhere along the way, we stopped trusting our own ability to have relationships with our world from ourselves. And a part of that is probably like removal from land base, meaningful land base, like you have to pay rent to be somewhere, you pay to have your food. It's lucky if you have a garden space somewhere where you can have those like physical interactions that are informing you of your relationship in a real way. Like that texture of informing, not just ideas. So what we're left with is ideas, because we don't have an everyday realm that is like our place to be there, not our place in an ownership way, but that like that's a part of our culture and that's a part of your everyday life, is that of course each and every person has their own relationship to the rest of nature because you're a part of it, and that you can trust the reflections you get from having that interaction.
Absolutely.
And so we're so starved for that people do like come to these classes or want to get involved in conservation because it's a need to be connected, because we just are. So something I've been trying to hold every time, I have the honor of being a teacher, as like, how do I just give you space to see the potential for your own relating? I want you to come back and tell me what's being reflected to you, because the only way I see that we end up having a more cultural or community understanding of how to tend a certain place is that everybody's having their own informed interactions, that we come together and we probably start to say some of the similar things. And we're like, oh, okay, this makes sense then. This is us. Like we can check in with each other rather than having to check in with something over there that we could never feel ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. Something that not everybody understands about conservation and its roots, again, is exactly that these conservationists that we're talking about, that were the elite people who were literally creating the conservation organizations that still exist today, creating the movement, making the decisions about how to go about doing things, creating all of our national parks. They all lived in New York City. Most of them lived in New York City, but various cities, these were urbanites. The reason they were creating these reserves was because they wanted to escape the city and have a place to go where they could have this idealized version of what things look like. So they were so out of touch when, like, you're talking about having that informed relationship, they were so far out of touch that they weren't even aware of the fact, like they were so uninformed in that aspect. And on top of that, I think about this concept of purity, and this idea of like wanting to segregate or remove anyone that's below you. It's like, these are people that, like, how would they have survived? How would they have lived their day-to-day life if they didn't have people doing things for them? So talk about a very detached, uninformed, And this was one of the reasons why there was so much opposition to conservation when it started. Right? I mean, not just from Indigenous people, but from early settlers. There's a book called Crimes Against Nature. I think his name is Carl Jacobi. I have to look up his name again, but where he talks about it from the other perspective of Indigenous people, but also settlers who hated conservationists because they were like, who are these people from the city telling me how to live my life? And how to interact with the landscape that I've been living on and subsisting on for years. And my family knows how to do this. And we so frequently think about conservation as like conservation came about because it was a reaction to all these stupid people that were going out there and destroying the forest and destroying the populations of animals. And no, that's not really what was happening. Industry moved in and we were shipping things to, Great Britain and stuff, exporting all of these things, using all of these industrial products. That was what was, it was the wealthy class that was pushing and driving the ecological destruction. The people that were living on the land, for the most part, were not doing that until industry moved in and they were removed, or conservation moved in and they were removed from their subsistence, not able to subsist anymore off of the land. So they were forced into wage labor, or they were forced into trapping or logging or stealing, poaching, whatever, so that they could feed their families. Right. So, our again, our conservation, the way that we go about conservation today is informed from that.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't make you screech to a halt right there and go, like, is it possible that we could maybe be going about this from the wrong angle? I don't know what could, and again, that's not to say that everything to do with conservation is wrong today, but a lot of things are coming from that, and we really need to be thinking about that. And absolutely, I'm right on board with you. Like, it gets really hard sometimes to be like, okay, how do we deal with all of these things? What do we do about all this stuff? And again, like, yeah, just like you said, as a teacher, for me, it's just like, how do we get people to open themselves up to see again, to do all the things that we're capable of doing and relating with plants and with the landscape and feeling these things, and then making decisions based off of that relationship, bringing people back into that place where they're actually having a relationship and not a perceived relationship, a place of control, an actual relationship that's dynamic and reciprocal, where they're receiving just as information as they're putting back out there.
It's like a sense of giving a sense of belonging back, offering that back.
Absolutely.
Just where you're standing right now, this has nothing to do with national identity, cultural identity. Just as a being here, you have belonging where you're standing at the moment.
Right.
Like, you can be here and sink in and reflect from here. It's okay.
Yeah. It's like the antidote to that nativism, right? Of that idea that only certain people are allowed to be certain places. And I feel like it's just like the plants, people and plants are very similar in a lot of ways. And I think that one of the things that we do, I'm not opposed to anthropomorphizing plants, but one of the things that we do is we put we kind of force our own issues, our own baggage onto them by saying, well, we're being told all the time that we're not allowed to be in certain places, or we're not welcome here because of whatever reason, because our ancestors weren't born here, or because our ancestors did something wrong, or because we're a certain color, or because we're a certain religion, or whatever the reason is, or because we have guilt about being here. And so I feel like we put that onto the plants and say, well, they shouldn't be here. They need to be somewhere else. They didn't. And it's just again, it's this putting the blinders on to the information that we have, which is that ecology and literally planet Earth exists by things moving around and then integrating into that place. And we seem to think that that's not possible, but it's like literally how every ecosystem that exists in the entire planet came to be. And every person, came to be is through that process, that, every population. So yeah, I think that is for me as a teacher, I'm right there with you. I think that is the most important thing, is having people ground into wherever it is that they are and have a relationship with what's there, with the land that's there and with themselves in that place. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It's like there's lots of things to address in society from the creation of these hierarchies and the genocides and removals that happen from that. Those are very real things to address, to have reparations for, and all of that. But but also understanding that, like, the same language that we're using for some of our reparations or our ideas around it came from this really weird place. And to me, it's like, I hear many times that, like, the invasive plants are colonizing the land. So as a part of reparations, it's this is why we're against them. They're bad. And it's like, yeah, but I think that itself is the colonizing energy. Like, how did we go from a place of being forced removal from direct connection with land, first our ancestors and their homelands, then coming here, doing it to somebody else. Like, wow, it's such an amazing thing that the process of, like, removal, conservation, keeping it separate from humans, and then it feels like it's come around to this place of, like, humans are bad. They have no beneficial interaction with land. And it's like, wow, in 100 years, like, we're able to come to that point where a lot of us have internalized that, whether we've been totally paying attention to these conversations or not. There's this thing we're carrying around that, like, we just kind of suck. And anything we do in the landscape that has an effect, if it's not within these things of trying to keep it separate from a reflection of us, like, is detrimental. And it's like, I don't understand how we continue holding that one. I think it's a dead end. Like, how can you, when you have to have an actual sense of belonging, connection with the place that you live, of course, like on this planet, in this world,
Yeah. A landscape cannot sustain any living entity that is not integrated into it.
Yeah.
Right. That's literally how everything works. You have to be integrated into it. And so if we're refusing to integrate into the landscape, it cannot sustain us. And so it is a dead end. In every aspect.
One thing we haven't specifically really said yet, but which is part of all this, is the wilderness ideal, because that came out of that whole time. And the wilderness ideal, which is very much with us now, in a particular form, is this idea that land is natural when there aren't humans on it, when there aren't people on it, and when it comes to the ecosystems of what's now the United States, this is completely ahistorical, because all of the ecosystems of the United States, where you are in Pennsylvania, on the West Coast, the Great Plains where I grew up, all of those ecosystems are new since the last glaciation period, right? So all of them started to form 11 or 12,000 years ago, but really weren't getting to a stage where we would recognize them now until 8 or even only 6,000 years ago. And human beings were here that entire time, because human beings have been here for at least 30,000 years, and some say 130,000. So in other words, as the ecosystems that we call native and refer to as native were forming, human beings were there the entire time as some sort of formative element. And we almost never put it this way, but in these landscapes, Homo sapiens is a native species.
Right, we're a keystone species. Yeah.
Absolutely. You know,
Yeah.
so that gets left out. That's why, you know, they were able to kick all the Indians out of Yosemite and all the other national parks, you know, where they did, et cetera. But this idea that like the only way to take care of nature is to keep us out of it, I still see that one all the time, you
Right.
know?
Yeah,
And
well, it's still happening. Yeah.
yeah, and then that applies to any of the plants that came with us or something like that, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fortress conservation, right?
Right. Right.
Right. So fortress conservation is this idea that you build a fortress around what needs to be preserved. And that if we can do that, somehow we can preserve biodiversity in a way that preserved fortress will be able to support all of the land around it. That doesn't work. Like that does not work. You can't take little pockets of the planet and preserve it and say that that's enough to sustain the things outside of it. It doesn't work that way. We know it doesn't work that way. I don't know why we're continuing to do this. Like when I say like we're continuing to create more fortress conservation districts. We're creating more and particularly in places like South America, like Africa, you know, we're seeing there's a book called Conservation Refugees, which if you haven't read it, I highly recommend. And it's talking about this, briefly talks about Yosemite as the model for the current application of fortress conservation all around the world and what that looks like and how the silver lining, the kind of slightly happy ending of that is that there are some changes, very, very small changes that are, in my mind, they're not nearly big enough to recognize and acknowledge that the Indigenous people that have been on those lands for, you know, thousands of years in many cases, are the reason why that place is worth conserving. It's the reason why we say this particular area is so biodiverse that we're going to conserve it and make it a park. We're going to push the people off of it, and then they're going to have to go and assimilate and get wage labor jobs. And then when they try to come back to their homelands and gather herbs or hunt or something, we're going to criminalize them and call them poachers and thieves. You know, and some of them are they're actually putting them into concentration camps. So this is still happening today. And it's happening because it's being because conservation is frequently being driven by what are called bingos or BINGOs, right? So basically industry pushing into these spaces. No, I don't think it's happening 100% of the time. I do think there are cases where conservation they're trying to preserve what they believe to be these biodiverse hotspots. But you can't create, like I always say, you can't quarantine nature, right? That doesn't work that way. You need to find a way to support whoever is living on the land from that landscape. And we probably don't have time to get into talking about like how that works in an urban environment. There is a little bit of separation that's happening there, but even those environments we need to start paying a lot more attention to because they're still growing. So we have to stop. We have to get out of this mindset that in order to protect nature, we need to separate from it, because otherwise, not only are we doing more harm than good to the nature itself, because humans are the ones that created the environment for a lot of the places that we want to preserve, but also because we as a species cannot continue to live on a planet that we don't integrate into. Like we can't continue to produce food and materials, you know, and all of these things. We can't continue to do it we certainly can't maintain the level of consumption. You know, I think a lot of people are coming to terms with that. But even if we reduce consumption, we still need to integrate to the landscape and be a part of it. And in order to do that, we have to do a lot of unlearning and damage control from this legacy of, like you were talking about, like believing that there is a pristine wilderness that is absent of people. I mean, that is one of the most harmful, pervasive myths of conservation that could have ever been brought into existence.
Yeah, one thing that came up, I heard a story recently about the carbon trading, you know, because climate change has been hijacked by the carbon conversation, whatever. So now there's people in Africa were being pushed out of these forests so that they could be bought by a company as a green capital. So
Right.
that is going on. But the other thing about the purity thing that's been coming up, as I've been getting a little more involved in activism, is that using that one as a reason for protecting something is really troublesome. Like I've seen, the mining company CEO talk about how it's okay to come in and take out some of the last remaining intact sagebrush ecoregions, to start chopping it up, because it's not exactly pristine sagebrush land.
Right.
Because there's a few grass species in there from, the relationship layers of ranching or fire.
Yeah.
And I see, people I really admire and who are wanting to protect these places, we're using that same language. And I don't think we understand what a disservice it is. Because I think what it ends up leaving us with is then we have to prove why some place is special.
Right.
We have to scramble to find that rare plant, and that's the only reason, that's the only potential that's going to save something. If we can show that this is not soiled land already, because there's an emotional thing that happens when we're like, oh, it's already a disturbed environment, or, we stop caring as much culturally. We have a little bit of that. Oh, it's already kind of messed up. Like maybe that's a good place for it then. This is the idea of sacrifice zone. This is how they get us to let go of our attention to allow sacrifice zones still.
Right.
To fragment things into parcels of wilderness, sacrifice zones, and people living in concrete in the middle. Like it doesn't, we know it doesn't work, but we still have these emotional things that are making it hard for us to hold a different narrative, which is like, if something has had a different kind of history where it's expressing different things, it's just like you or I having a story from our past that hurt us. There's a certain way in which we grow a little different. It doesn't mean there's something wrong and it's not worth it. It's like, I was telling Kollibri this morning that it's like, it's removing the ability to see things as sacred. It's like sacredness is a relationship. It's not this place can be sacred and this place never can.
Right.
It's how we're approaching and holding things. It's that relationship part again. So I've been seeing it as like a problem in protection efforts, Yeah.
Right. Because if we're looking for this purity as being, okay, that's why this place is worth saving, then all these places that aren't, quote, pure because they have because of, they have deteriorated. There's tenant 2 or tenant 3 have an invasive species, and then now they're not worth saving. But unfortunately, what we're dealing with right now on a practical basis is the fact that most of the world is like this,
Right.
Like
it has a trace.
there's, I in working on this book that I'm working on, I saw one figure that under some ways of measuring what undisturbed or pristine might mean, only 3% of the planet's surface at this point could be considered that.
I'm surprised it's that much.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But so I think this is the part that people don't understand too. And again, it gets back to this urban bias that you pointed out. So like people living in the city, not realizing that that's nature happening all around them. I'm right there with you with all the urban ecology, right? And then 2, not realizing how much of what is green is out once they leave the city is what the nature of that land is, so like, living in Oregon, for example, people would love to drive out to Oregon wine country and it's so it's so beautiful out here and so open and it's like, well, do you have, with no idea of how many chemicals are used, to keep it like that, chemicals that are so dangerous and toxic they're not allowed to be used in the city even, just a real. And so into this vacuum of actual knowledge and actual experience, this ideal comes, or this ideology comes in and fills in that space. And so rather than going from actual knowledge or actual experience, it is just this idea that is based in an idealism and becomes dogmatic very quickly. And that, as you've been pointing out, here so well, it is going back to these, really nasty roots.
Mhm. How is it any different to say that a region of where there's plants that are not from that place have moved in and done so-called damage? And so that therefore we can sacrifice that to build a big, whatever, a big power plant or dump some toxic waste there or whatever it is, put a pipeline through. How is that any different than what we already do with people, which is we put those zones wherever there are, poor communities or communities of color or indigenous communities because we just don't care. Now, if you had a wealthy, community, you're not going to see that happen there, right? But it's just not gonna, it's not gonna happen.
Mhm.
So as much as I adore native plants, what we call native plants, and we can talk about, for sure, we can talk about what does that even mean? Because
Right.
the rhetoric and definitions of that are very slippery.
Yeah.
But as much as I love the plants that are being, called native by conservation advocates, and I would love to see them proliferate and thrive,
Mhm.
they are no more important than any other plant. I don't believe that they are. And we can talk about coevolutionary relationships, and that's usually the big argument for people that get upset when I talk about this and say, well, what about all of the relationships and things will just collapse? No, that stuff happens so fast. We are so again, we don't have the information that we think that we do. People think it takes millions of years for coevolutionary relationships to happen. It doesn't. It can happen in a few generations. We know this now. They've studied this with Darwin's finches. There's new Darwin's finches that occurred. I think it was in like less than, it was like 2 or 3 generations. And now they're going, oh, so maybe it doesn't take forever. So why are we so afraid? So if we know, if the science is pointing to the science that's done well, without bias, frequently is pointing to saying these plants are not, there's no moral application we can put, it's not like these plants are good and these plants are bad. Then why are we still doing that? And I think it does come down to this idea of purity, of like, why are we so afraid of plants and animals hybridizing with each other?
Yeah.
They're doing that of their own volition. You want to talk about wild or natural and those kind of ambiguous terms, but people that's pretty freaking wild.
Mhm.
It
If
is.
an animal or plant is saying I'm going to hybridize, and you have people who are saying we can't allow that to happen,
Mhm.
and it does happen. I mean, like I still can't get over the barred owl situation in the Northwest, like literally shooting barred owls because they're hybridizing with their endangered owl species there.
I
Like,
had not heard that.
yeah, it just mind blowing to me.
Mhm.
And then we're so terrified. I mean, that's miscegenation. That's exactly what that is.
Right.
We're terrified of this genetic mixing because
Mhm.
then we won't have those pure species anymore.
Mhm.
Even in the scientific literature about this, you see them use terms like genetic pollution,
Right.
which is,
Absolutely.
I was shocked the first time I saw that, because even before I'd heard your podcast
Mhm.
with Kelly and I saw that genetic pollution, I made the connection to eugenics. So I'm like, well, that's where that term comes from. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we see as far as the rhetoric goes, that um it's identical. Like if you were to lay out some statements, and some of them are from eugenicists about people from the 1920s, and some of them are from modern day conservation biologists or the media talking about these plants, um, and mix them all together, you wouldn't be able to figure out which is which. I mean, it's awful. Um, so yeah, I think about yeah, what exactly what actually is it that why are we so afraid to allow hybridization to happen? Why are we so afraid to allow species to move around, um, and do what they're trying to we're trying to preserve this wildness, this nature, um, as we've so described it. And then when nature and wildness happens, we're like, oh, no, that can't happen. We need to maintain purity. And it's just like, I don't know where else that could possibly come from if it's not from this backwards mentality about, basically racial purity, just apply it to plants. And like I said, given the fact that they're coming from the same root, it's like, it just makes so much sense to me. Yeah. So, and I also think about too, like, so, the definition of native, right? So the definition of native, non-native, invasive, all of those words. When I see people trying to define them, and I see different examples of around different parts of the world, how they're defined, which oftentimes it's based on a timeline. It's based on if plants were here before such and such, before before Columbus arrived, or in Britain, it's a slightly different timeline. It's similar, but it's like they have different words for before and after the glaciations of plants that were there. Like their archaeophytes are the ones that I believe were there before the last glaciation. So it's like trying to like put these things into boxes and determine whether they're native or non-native. When I read that information, it reads like reading just like the way that these people who were trying to define race define things. It's just the same. It's like, we know race exists because we can measure it this way and this way and that way. And it was science, quote unquote, right? It was science that was being done, and they were taking, like I said, they were taking Darwinism, and they were taking, Gregor Mendel's theory of, laws of inheritance, and all these different things, and they were saying, good science, we're gonna take this and we're gonna all combine all this information into this theory about, racial hygiene. And it worked. It convinced a lot of people for a number of years. And it's a direct parallel in my mind when I see people defending native versus non-native, because in order to do that, you have to throw out logic and reason about how ecologies form, about all these things we're talking about. You can't say that ecologies are dynamic and then say, but after 1492 they can't be dynamic anymore. So I think even that the rhetoric and terminology is very similar as far as defining those terms, and then also seeing how the rhetoric changes. Like I know after 9/11, we started seeing plants are no longer just being termed as like, invasive aliens and things like that. Now they're actually terrorists, right? And so we can see the rhetoric change, and the rhetoric is informed by the people who are having an emotional reaction to their society and the current events. It's the reason why Charles Elton and H.C. Hewitt developed the terminology to begin with, is because they were traumatized by the world wars. So we have a lot of untangling to do in regards to being really, really authentic and clear in the way that we're communicating, because it's just so biased. I don't know how we can call ourselves scientists and have such biased, emotionally charged language. And I'm all about being emotionally charged. I'm all about being, in the moment and being passionate. But if we're going to talk about science, we need to let go of that. And it's just not being done. You guys are very well aware of the hateful rhetoric that comes from invasion biology. And it's just like, just the fact that it exists at all is testament to the fact that people are producing papers from emotion.
It's really
not from good science.
It's really gotten quite popular, like more and more popular. I see these different, people on the social media who have like 3,000 likes or something, and it's from them like hating a species and like calling it names and kicking it and stuff like that. And it's just like, wow, okay, that's all you have to do to get 3,000 likes and
Yeah.
followers, and wow, this is scary.
Mhm.
You know?
Right.
And then the other thing that was occurring to me in your speaking there was that, like, remembering again, like, where this idea of purity came from was it's a curtain, you know. There was other things socially that were going on to
Right.
put this purity thing out there, to have the people starting to pay attention to that, instead of what's going on behind, which is reorganizing and taking charge of resources and disconnecting you from your own ability to be in a place,
Right.
you know. So like the one that comes to mind for me is like the monstering of tamarisk. Like, that was originally started by a mining company,
Mhm.
the Morenci mine in Arizona. They
Mhm.
started that whole thing, and everybody still repeats it.
Right.
Because tamarisk comes up below the dams they put in to make it an open pit mine.
Mhm.
So we took their language, and now we argue about that and spend billions of dollars spraying more poisons, when they just get to open up another mine because we're distracted over there
Right.
with this purity thing. Like,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah, eugenics was and is class warfare.
yeah.
You know,
Mm.
yeah. So you have to always look, right, like you're saying, under the surface. And uh when as far as invasive species, you hear this you always hear this, like, well, they're, because the fear, right, just like the fear with among, you know, in eugenics, the fear is that they're going to do damage. They're going to damage the ecosystem. They're displacing things. They're not being very well behaved. And it's confirmed for people because they see damaged ecosystems everywhere they look.
Right.
But we have to go back to the root, like what's, like you're saying, like what's underneath that. And it's frequently, it's pretty much always the fact that we have altered the ecosystem. We need to stop pretending that we're not um, we're not the ones that are driving this whole thing. But at the same time, we need to stop self-flagellating and feeling bad, like we're bad humans, right? We need to find a space to move into where we can say, okay, like we've caused some damage, the human race, you know, primarily industry, and you know, we've caused some damage to the ecosystem, whatever ecosystem we're looking at, and some changes are occurring. Okay, and then what are we going to do about those changes? Are we going to freak out and start, you know, applying morality, you know, moral labels to things, or are we going to just say, okay, let's sit here and observe, and let's come back to what is actually happening, and what is at the root of what's actually happening, and what are the plants trying to teach us about what's happening in that environment? I always come back to, whenever I feel like I get to a point where I'm stuck, or I'm like, what the hell is going on with any of this stuff? I come back to the plants are in my brain, there are elder siblings, right? They're the ones that are showing us the path forward.
Right.
They don't do the messed up things that we do. We assert that onto them. And so if we can just observe, like, what is happening to these heavily disturbed ecosystems, where there are a lot of species that are moving in that people are getting upset about. Why are they there, and what are they doing? And if we can actually just stop and think about that and observe that process, we would come away with a lot more answers than we have right now. And people are just not doing that. They go and they see this damage that happens, and they see the plants move in, and they see it as part of the damage, and they just want to get rid of them and kind of start over and bring things back to the way they were. Yeah, so
It's
I don't know.
I think that it's like, yeah, wow, we could have such a wealth more of understanding and information if we could see how plants don't lie.
Mhm.
Plants that come up in an area are the ones who are showing you the layers of past relationships. You can find multiple layers at a site, you know. That's
Mhm.
something I've been, you know, spending more and more time doing and appreciating and understanding. It's like, oh, yeah, that's the one that likes to come up there. So that must have happened here at some point in time. You know, like it's not just about a seed coming in, you know, we could be sitting in the middle of a desert and see a yellow mustard bloom, and it's in a square shape. It's in the shape of the pasture that was there. Not all over the valley, you know. So, and that's just like so much more useful for formulating new ways of new directions from now. I'm like, oh, this is all what's happened here. So maybe if I keep applying the same disturbance here right now, I might end up just encouraging this more when, oh, I'd like to tend towards something else. It's fine for you to make a subjective decision of what direction you want to tend as a part of that, as integration into that environment. So it's nothing about like not weeding your garden. It's just like actually be there first. And wow, the plants will show you so much about what's happened there. It's like reading a book. Like, I was thinking about it. I was in the middle of one of the basins in Nevada at these hot springs. And, you know, it's kind of like alkali playa flat and the hot springs. And when it gets muddy, the mud gets real deep. And you could see these like deep ruts from someone who drove through when it was muddy. Only took once. And there's not like a bunch of plants growing around those ruts, but right on the ruts, it's like this lush, like orange and yellow, you know, pretty fall, autumn display going on of all these super pokey plants, you know. People will be like, oh, you know, like don't want to walk through them, or those are your weeds, right? It's like it's the middle of the desert. They're like rudderol. It's really, I took a picture because it's like little rudderol, you know, like, coming up in that rut, you know. But then I was sitting in the hot springs and there was like this little song that started to come into my heart, just like seeing all the pokey chenopod's and halogitans and stuff, you know, on the edge of the alkali there. And I was just like, I think all of us recognize the feeling of being around a rough edge, you know, like walking through a ditch area where everything's a little scratchy and you have your brambles or whatever. Like we know that sensation. And it makes sense actually that like, oh, that's this kind of place. Yeah, it's kind of like the seedy edge of things. Like that, we already know that that's a place that exists in our world. It's a natural thing that happens at these edges that have these different mixing of things that have gone on, or these different disturbances or whatever, and then are kind of like forgotten or not ventured into. And it's like, yeah, I see that edge. You know, I'm so glad that they exist in my world. I would have no context for understanding those dynamics if I didn't have that recognized feeling, not as an ecologist, but just as a human who has been in those spaces, who walks past those spaces in your city, maybe even in those back alleys or whatever that have little patches of soil. Like there's a feeling that goes with that just makes sense. You know, it's telling you so much more information than that plant sucks, you know.
And what would we do if we didn't have those species, right? It's like, who would be able to move in and heal the wounds that are created in that landscape if it wasn't for those species doing it? Yeah. And I think, you know, we're so quick to say, you know, native or non-native, you know, like we have those species everywhere. There, you know, it doesn't matter where you go, you're going to have species that act and behave in certain ways depending on how they evolved and what they like to do. The only reason we judge them is because they're not from that space. They're not, you know, for whatever timeline you want to apply to that. But yeah, I think about, they're my favorite. I mean, they are my absolute favorite of the plants that, that come up and they're often the medicinal species, you know. There's certainly the abundant species that are right at your feet, literally, because your feet are there. You know, creating that impact. But yeah, I absolutely adore them. And I'm so grateful for those species that do, you know, those behaviors that are considered misbehaviors by so many, because they are literally moving in and healing that space, you know. And I also think, like, I think of Ailanthus a lot, and Japanese knotweed is like, those are two of my favorites, and they're very prevalent around here. Is like, they're like, I feel like they're like the steady, like through the apocalypse, I can rely on them, you know, like they're there, they're like, I'm going to be fine. And I'm going to show you how to just be okay, no matter what crazy circumstances come up. they're just such a great illustration for great teachers for like how to have that mentality and how to live that way. And I have seen so many students, I've seen so many people who, at the beginning of a class, or sometimes at the beginning of a couple classes, it takes some people longer than others, but usually it's like from the beginning of a class, because I talk about this topic almost every class. I actually taught medicine making yesterday, and it came up. I was like, we're not even out in the field talking about botany. And Japanese knotweed came up, but I've seen so many people come into a class and they go, a plant comes up, or they go, oh, that plant, like, calorie pear, or, Japanese knotweed, or whatever, and they have all this burden on them, this tension, this anger. And then I talk, and, so usually they get a little triggered at first, and they're like resistant. And almost always, by the end of that conversation, by the end of that class, it's like a weight has been lifted. I don't have to hate this anymore.
Right.
And then I talk to them again later, and they go, that just changed my entire world. Like, I was carrying so much anger around with me, and now I can walk through my garden, and I know that this plant that's coming up in my garden isn't horrible, and I can eat it, and I have a relationship with it now. And now when I see it, it makes me smile. I went through that. I mean, I went through that with a couple different plants, but I went through that with honeysuckle. I went through that with Japanese barberry, where before it occurred to me that I shouldn't take it at face value that I'm supposed to hate these plants. I felt a lot of conflict in myself, of like feeling like, oh, this is just this, like the Japanese barberry, it's just a sign of all the damage that we've done as humans, and it's everywhere, and it's taking over. And it really had that warlike mentality in my brain. And then I sat with it one day, literally just sat down with Japanese barberry, and asked it, well, why are you here? Like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you here? Why are you taking over everything? And the kind of like conclusion that I came to was, the plant was just like, I'm just here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just here. I'm just being food. And I think about that all the time, like the number of people, including myself, that have gone through that transformation. Could you imagine what the world would be like if people could go through that? And not only in regards to plants, but in regards to people.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we can do that with plants, if we can show people that they can change their mind pretty quickly, actually, by just questioning, who told me that I have to hate this thing?
Right.
What's behind that? And, kind of unravel some of the arguments, some of the debates about that, and let people just lay it out and say, some people say this, some people say this, but there are two sides to this conversation. And, one side gets talked about a lot more than the other, but do with it what you will. People want to take they don't want to hate things. I think deep down, most of us don't want to feel that and have that burden. And that's another one of the reasons why I'm so deep in this, because I've seen that transformation. And I've like I said, I'm a clinical herbalist, and I've worked with a lot of people and taken them through emotional and physical healing a number of times, and I've never seen something happen so fast. Just like within an hour, just have them be like this change in their entire being around a relationship with a plant. That's powerful.
Yeah, it's like there's this assumption that if you're, don't hate invasive plants, that you don't like native plants. And it's like, I never agreed to not like any of them.
Right.
It's okay. Yeah. They're all cool. They're all doing their thing,
Yeah.
But yeah, I've had that experience with people, and it's been a nice practice in myself of really wanting to be in a place I'm like, I don't want to argue. I don't want to be combative. Like it's not my goal here, And it's been really cool a couple times to be on walks, even with people who are starting to get a little, amped up from listening to me. Because if you're talking about ecology or tending or, cultural landscapes, planting comes up, and people are really afraid of planting. So the whole conversation has to come out then, otherwise we can't just focus on what we came out there to focus on,
Right.
which is tending and moving plants around, and like humans have been doing.
Mhm.
But I had a really interesting experience with someone once who was getting really quite worked up, and I was like, oh, okay, in myself, like, well, I'm just gonna continue saying what I'm saying, but like, I'm not trying to push him in any way. Like, he can,
Mhm.
that's fine. I'm just saying, like, well, we might want to look at it again. It's hard to take apart the ideas we've been given from our looking. I'm like
Right.
encouraging people to be observing and sitting with their observations, but I'm like, but as we're doing that, we still have to be pulling out the things that are in there that we're like, oh yeah, I am seeing this then. I'm like, because it's hard to do. That's all I'm saying.
Mhm.
And I didn't know it until like I was like, oh, I probably made that person mad. And it's cool. Like, I can't, I'm not trying to convince everybody at all.
Right.
But I ended up getting a day later, the person who had invited me out there to do this walk was like, yeah, this person wrote in, was just like, thank you so much for bringing Nikki. Like, they really like opened my eyes to some things and really changed my outlook. And it turns out that had been the previous mayor of that town.
Oh my.
He had been involved in a lot of like, invasive species removal projects. And he was like, wow, my mind's pretty changed. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's cool. But that was
Mhm.
me like giving up. Like, I don't want to make people mad. That's not what this is
Yeah.
about. It's besides the point.
Mhm. Well, and I know, so we've talked a little bit about how it's different talking to people online versus talking to people in
Yeah.
person, and how people, the nature of being online is that it often leads to impoliteness and arguments and things like that. And what I have found, and I mean, this isn't, I mean, there's lots of reasons for that, but what I have found, it's very difficult to be standing with the plant, and the plant is there, and you like introduce people to the plant and you talk about it and talk about all of its qualities and virtues and why it's here, and you're standing there with the plant. It's much harder for them to say, I hate that, when they're in the presence of the plant.
Right.
It's like you're able, there's something about that, because they're having that direct relationship. They're in the presence of the plant where they actually have to stay, like, they're in that space, they're sharing space with that plant. And I don't know, I feel like that's a big part of it, of like just yeah, just, and also just, yeah, just being around people who are like, I whenever I do plant walks and I teach classes, those are the plants I get all excited about.
Mhm.
And people see my face light up and they're like, this plant is amazing. I've worked with so many people with this plant. It does amazing things, or it's amazing because it does this with the ecology. And then somebody will be like, isn't this plant invasive? And it's like, how can we begin to like reconcile that? That it's not all bad. And if you try to suggest that online, that like, well, I had a conversation recently in the past few months where somebody asked, I forget which plant it was, asked if a plant had, it might have been calorie pear actually. Anyway, they asked, does this plant have any ecological benefits at all? And oh my goodness, like all I was like, perhaps it might. And just, it was just a full on like attack of, people were so upset that I said this. They said I was just so incredibly irresponsible, and
Mhm.
and I wonder how that conversation might have been different if we're standing there with a calorie tree or whatever. I forget which plant it was, but
Yeah.
and actually observing squirrels eating it, or you know what I mean? Like actually seeing the fact that it's here and it has a purpose. But what about the fact that when they count biodiversity, when they determine how biodiverse something is, they don't count non-native species in that?
No.
Mind-blowing. If we
Yeah.
did that, then Hawaii would be considered more biodiverse now than it was prior to all these species moving in.
It is really important to recognize that like people have this idea like, oh, we have these biodiversity measures that's measuring species richness, like,
Mhm.
but they're not counting any of the non-native ones that they want to look at. So you're not getting accurate biodiversity readings just for the definition of biodiversity, which is a lot of different kinds of life being there.
Right.
And then the other part is that like the understanding of disturbance not just as a dirty word,
Right.
and
Right.
how
Mhm.
humans have a place in the world as small scale disturbance creatures. That's how we are a keystone species in some of these examples in our past and some of our examples now, is these small scale disturbances. Like I can't remember any of the names right now, but there was like some of the terra preta soils in Brazil, they're coming to find was people throwing out their compost or turning them over. You'll have this style of ancient gardening that'll be these big piles that get turned over and over again. So a place of high disturbance that were around places people spent quite a bit of time. That was associated with slash and burn cultivation as well. But those are the places that are like so biodiverse. They'll be like in this like, the size of this room or something, I don't know, 50 by 50 foot. There'll be like 200 different kinds of medicines and plants in there.
Right.
Like this disturbance is a part of the process of biodiversity. So we have to like temper all of this with remembering what we're talking about. What we're so afraid of is all of our examples of like massive scale disturbance that's a homogenizing relationship. So in every valley, you've channelized the creeks and put in grazing or milk farms or something, depending on where you are. But it's like, it's that homogenization of like really intense disturbance is really the thing we're responding to. But we can't just throw out disturbance either, because that is a process of biodiversity.
Right. Right. Well, we know now that a lot of the most biodiverse regions of those rainforests were planted, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't even just by accident. Like it was, yeah. I think that we need to find the middle ground, and we need to find the nuance between these things, because it's not like we're suggesting that we cannot ever, lay a hand on things. It's not like we're suggesting that we can't manage the land, that we can't make educated decisions about, because that's why we're here. It's what we've been doing for millennia. The question is, what is informing those decisions? And I don't know. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Emma Maris, but she, the author of Rambunctious Garden, and she came up with a new book recently, Wild Souls, I think it's called. And she talks about, I forget actually which book she talks about it in, but in one of those books, she talks about this idea of like boom and bust, that basically that we're getting in the way of adaptation.
Right.
So by so desperately trying to, we're so desperately trying to not have an impact on nature, by removing any potential signs of impact, removing the invasive species, and conserving this spot and keeping people off of it. And that's the way that we're managing it, that we're actually preventing the natural succession, the natural occurrence of how a plant, which is what plants do, which all species do, move into an area. And then there's a little bit of back and forth that happens, a little bit of pressure on either side. And then it finally integrates into that food web, that ecosystem. And she's suggesting, and I know there's a couple of other people that are suggesting this too, that we're getting in the way of that process. We're actually slowing down the process of coevolution and adaptation by having this stranglehold on things. Now, does that mean that things are never going to go extinct? Like if we let things have their own processes? No, and we are going through like a rapid extinction event right now, which is not great. But extinction is also part of how ecology goes, right? It's part of the story. And if the goal is, healthy ecosystems that can sustain themselves and us as part of the ecosystem, then I think we seriously need to look into this idea. I think it probably has a lot of validity in regards to, we're not, even if we said, okay, everything that we just said, we just take it all back, invasive species are horrible, we need to get rid of all of them, right? That's not happening, right?
Right.
I think people are pretty well have come to that determination at this point.
Yeah.
That's not possible. The immense amount of biological warfare that we are currently waging against these plants isn't enough to get rid of them. Nothing is going to make them go back to where they came from. It's just not going to happen. So we need to start thinking about, how do we allow them to integrate? how do we do it in a way that mitigates damage? And really, we're mitigating the damage that we're causing by, like you're saying, these massive disturbances. Things like dams and things like removal of major keystone species and, eutrophication and all of those types of things. So yeah, and then just letting the plants do their work and letting the animals do their work. Let them hybridize, let them integrate into the food web. It might seem a little bit sticky for a little while, but they will. They always do. That's how every species that exists.
Mm-hmm.
We also have this problem of thinking on a very narrow time scale of like,
Right.
Bad things might be happening and we need to react and we need to stop this right now. And it's like, that's a very human-centric time scale of like not allowing things to unfold. And most of the species that are deemed invasive, like look at the lanternfly, right? The lanternfly, everybody, I don't know if you guys have lanternflies out there, but over here we have this lanternfly, like this drama unfolding over these past couple of years. And it was based on a projection that they thought the lanternfly was going to have this massive harmful impact on primarily on agricultural industry, so on grapes and apples. But they were like, it's going to destroy all of the native trees. It's going to kill all the saplings. We need to squash it. I don't know how many times I've had to I have kids and my kids love the lanternflies because I've told them that they're not horrible. And I don't know how many times I've witnessed my son, like at least 5 times, where he's gone up to another kid who's squashing lanternflies and saying, you don't have to do that. Okay, so it's so rampant that like we're teaching our children to squash the lanternflies. They're horrible, they're bad bugs. We have to squash them. Turns out that projection was wrong. And lanternflies are actually not really causing that much damage. They're causing very mild amounts of damage to specifically the wine industry's grapes, which are non-native grapes, by the way. If we're going to be putting labels on things, they're not causing this widespread damage that everybody thought. And there's so many cases of that where we think we're like worried about what's going to happen. And so we're trying to be proactive. We're trying to do the right thing. We have this moral imperative to protect things, but it turns out totally fine. And the vast majority of species that come over here either don't stick or don't cause problems. And the few that we say do, we're not really fully understanding the whole picture of why they're perceiving things to be that way.
This is why I really wanted to talk to you today, was just to help for people to see that the data is often not there. Sometimes it's incorrect. And so where is it that this hatred is coming from? And it's coming from these cultural elements. And in this particular case, it's coming from this really ugly cultural element, of eugenics, which, rightly at this point, most people, recognize as being terrible, even if they don't recognize some of the newer versions of it as being part of it. But because we're so separated, we're easy to manipulate in this way, as well.
Yeah. And I think it's like again, the term, going back to the terminology, some of the terminology that was used when we're talking about eugenics was like literally things like human weeds, right? That we need to root out the human weeds and things like that. So yeah, it's the same perspective, it's the same mindset. Yeah, absolutely. I do think, I'm all for understanding, like diving into the science. Let's do the science. Let's do the research. Let's figure out what the actual impact of things are and inform our management practices based on that information. I've gotten some statements. I've gotten some feedback from these types of conversations, from people saying, "You're damaging the conservation movement by pointing fingers at it. You can't tear it apart because you're going to destroy this movement that is already so fragile." And I think that people are so afraid to, because there's so much at stake, people are so afraid to have these conversations and really look at these things. But I wouldn't say that conservation as it exists today is succeeding. I don't know how you guys feel, but I would say that it's been a massive failure across the board. So if that wasn't the case, then we probably wouldn't have to have this conversation anyway, right? If it was successful and if things were going well. I just don't see that to be the case. And I see the fact that we're still having conservation causing, they're still causing people to become refugees, and we're causing all of this damage. We're damaging people's ability to have relationships with plants, damaging people's ability to have empathy for the natural world around them, damaging people's perspectives and perceptions about what nature even is and what an ecosystem is, and having relationship to the places where they live so that they can be sustained by that land. There's so much damage that's being done, and it's not successful even for what it sets out to do. Why wouldn't we tear it apart and look at all the pieces? And maybe there's parts of that we can hang on to and say, this is actually pretty good. Let's hang on to this. But any institution worth having should be done with. We should be observing it, dissecting it, and deciding to that's how. I just feel like that's what we should be doing it with everything. If we're gonna have any form of progress, however you define that term, if we're going to progress as humans, we have to be able to look at the demons in our closet, and face that and make better decisions. So yeah, I know. I mean, sometimes I feel like we just need to, like, I think I said this on Kelly's podcast, like we need to burn it all down. We need to just completely start over. I do feel that way sometimes, but I imagine there are things that we can work with, some of the parts of conservation, but a lot of it needs to be discarded, and a lot of it, I think the majority of it comes from these concepts of purity, from these concepts of wanting to control things, from the class warfare, the race warfare that has been, a part of this conversation from the beginning. We need to get rid of anything that came from those aspects. And these are not going to be easy conversations to have.
I think some of it can happen in terms of reframing too, and be like, take the Wilderness Act, for example, right? So the Wilderness Act, came out of that milieu in the 30s. The Wilderness Act was about this idea that pristine wilderness doesn't have any humans in it, et cetera, et cetera. However, the Wilderness Act also came in and did save some freaking places from getting chopped down, and dammed, and and all this. And so the fact that occurred, was a good thing. Right. Where I would say it's about framing is to be like, okay, that's great. We're thankful that happened. But instead of thinking of the Wilderness Act as an end, to think of it as a starting point, to be like, okay, our starting point was that some people very sensibly said, oh, hey, stop. Just stop everything for a minute. Okay, we did. We've stopped everything for a minute. Thank God we did. Now we need to take a look again and be like, okay, but, what did we leave out, that first time around? Oh, we left out the fact that, humans were a keystone species in this area, we left out that we need to bring all the beavers back in here because we don't even know what these rivers are supposed to look like, et cetera, but to look at the Wilderness Act, and so we're not saying, in that case, I would say, I'm not saying throw out the Wilderness Act because it came, from this. I'm saying, let's stop looking at the Wilderness Act as the finish line. And then also I think recognize that subjectivity is always going to be part of these decisions. That subjectivity that is a very human quality, so native land management that here in the West used fire to suppress fir trees in order to have better oak groves, that was a subjective decision that was made. That was a subjective choice. So also then recognizing that our subjectivity is part of that relationship as well, and that we also need to allow that the space to come in alongside the science, which is attempting to be objective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's the integrating into the landscape part again.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I would say I would agree, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that there's some places that haven't just been open to whatever yet, but I also know how fragile that is.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of it's set aside because it has certain resources, and when they're ready for it, they'll go get it. Right. So
well, yeah,
it's not an end in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to speak to the part where like, some people involved in conservation might be like, have had their experiences where they're like, oh, in this project I was on, I saw this work, where we came in and we took out these species and we planted some of these ones and we saw it change,
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that like that maybe has more to do with the subjective part of being engaged with something.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were taking a subjective approach in that project and deciding that that's what you were going to do there. Mm-hmm. But then to say that, oh, if we do this everywhere, this will always be the result. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true. Yeah. And also, like, I'm not sure how long people are retained and able to keep revisiting the projects that they get involved in on a volunteer day or whatever, to mm-hmm. have that long-term integration to see what happens after you stop going in there and pulling. Mm-hmm. Do they all just come back, but then the other ones are there too? And I mean, there's just so much more to see than just right away. So that is the integration again too, is that access for people to have long-term engagements with any of these projects where for whatever reason they've decided they're really invested in this outcome there. And then mm-hmm. please question why you're invested in that outcome there. Be honest about it. And that's okay right. that you're making a choice on that,
Yeah.
But in different places, it might have different results. So be careful.
Right. Right. And also thinking about where does the funding come from and what is right. able to be funded. So some of these projects where it's like you have a larger amount of funding to make changes, maybe that does mean going in and pulling things and planting things, right? Probably not spraying them. Why is there so much funding for that particular site? Often it's because they want something from that place. Mm-hmm. And so I think like Kollibri, what you were just talking about a minute ago about like, let's reframe the Wilderness Act, bring people back onto the landscape, and integrate them into part of that. If we could increase ecological literacy among the population and get them to be able to feel like they're making an impact. There's so many people that I talk to all the time who are like, I feel like there's nothing that I can do. And I think that's where a lot of this vitriol against invasive species comes from, because they're like, I can do something about it. I can rip these out. I can support this cause because it makes them feel good. Mm-hmm. Because they feel like they're part of the war movement and the war effort, And but I think if we could educate people on how to integrate and land steward, like tend land in a healthy way, from a healthy perspective, we would be able to maintain, people would have access to land then, and we'd be able to maintain these changes that we want to maintain, that we can't otherwise maintain through funding without having the negative consequences of where does all that large amount of money come from,
right?
So I think like just, and also that then it plays into the conversation about like, how do we get people to value the land enough to want to care for it, But, and also I was just thinking about also part of this conversation is holding these international and national conservation organizations, especially these private organizations, are we holding them accountable to what they say they're doing? Mm-hmm. They're saying that they're doing this where they're preserving this land, and then they're pushing Native people off the land, and then they're inviting industry in. And one of the quotes from that conservation refugee books, one of the things that he says in there is like, or maybe he might be quoting someone else actually, but one of the statements in there was, how is it possible that these pastoralists are going to have too much of an ecological footprint and impact on a landscape that we can invite miners onto and invite loggers onto and invite, so even if we were sitting here saying, let's embrace the modern conservation model, even that is broken in that they're not actually being held accountable for the dishonesty that's occurring, and for how deeply tied in they are with industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's hard to pull out all of the different layers that go into it. I've been looking at the fire mitigation language a lot here in the Sierras lately, and wow, that's like a pretty polarized thing too, in part because it has a lot of the industry layers in there and all that language. And a part of it is like, things get moving so quickly. There's so much funding at once that it's hard to just be like, hey, the only possible way if this works in a different way is if it's not done from logging perspective.
Right.
But we rarely given time with all of the influx of resources and the fear of wildfire creates no space for actually containing that conversation of how you want to work with that within the community there, but it is interesting to be pawing through so many protocol documents of different kinds and realize that, oh my gosh, there's so much that's already been written. And a lot of these larger agencies actually do have a different perception of non-native plants. Like they have been changing their language to be like, well, okay, we have to start looking at how we are managing these places in the face of climate change because it's not going to work how we've been doing it. That language is in there at the high levels of BLM, other government agencies. It's just that it gets translated differently, maybe into the common realm, or it takes a while to be understood that like people in different realms of these big agencies are already having these conversations in a different way. It doesn't mean we're seeing it differently. And I'm not saying that like, oh, I totally trust and back them up then, but just saying that like, they're not actually having the same biases. I have a friend who gathers seeds and sells them. He's like a seed ambassador for other countries who want to plant forests because climate change is coming. So they're like, yeah, send us redwood seeds. We're going to plant a redwood forest and, where the climate's going to be right for them in the next 10 years. We're not worried about where it comes from. We're not worried about getting local seed. And these are government agencies. So it's like our commonplace again is like we get stuck in a different conversation, in a narrower view than the people who created those rules are even operating by. They're not operating by those rules. They don't feel those walls in the same way that we do, which I think a part is like us taking on the guilt, the individual guilt. Right. So yeah.
I do wonder sometimes, I think about that, like how much you guys are being chased by the sun. I think about how much these conversations are happening in higher up the ranks that we just don't know about because they don't get the ear of the media and they're not the popular opinion at the time right now. Because I'm finding more and more people are like, yes, I've heard about that, and more more books being published and things like that, people talking about this. And so it does give me a little bit of hope and hearing that from you, that you're seeing that pattern change a little bit is inspiring. It's good.
And I'm not sure how long it lasts, and I'm not sure that it's not being used manipulative way in all kinds of angles. Like the whole thing about like we just had our zones changed in North America for
growing zones,
growing zones. They jumped like 2 zones. That's a big deal.
Right.
That's like, things that describe that ecoregion of what grows there have changed a lot, and that's recognized now. But like I hear it a lot still that like the response to climate change is that, oh, with climate change, we're going to see a lot more species moving, plants and animal species moving. But then like in that same sentence, the response to climate change is to fight invasive species. And
Right.
it's like, I don't how can anybody take that seriously? Like, we're just admitting why it's going to be moving.
And
no.
There's so many it's crazy how much they contradict themselves in those types of situations. Because I mean, we're going to change the zones, but then I have there's so many people here where they're like, that plant isn't native to this county.
Yeah.
Like they changed the zones, people. Like, things are going to be moving a lot more than county to county or basic, tiny bioregion to bioregion. I think that we're approaching a point where we're not going to be able to pretend anymore that this isn't a thing. I mean, climate change alone is enough to show people that like things are going to change. And we need to come to terms with that. And not to be nihilistic, but for me, that's like, okay, so that means we get to embrace the plants that are adapting, and we better adapt too if we're going to survive this. And I do think that there are plenty of people. I do think there are plenty of people who are in conservation, probably the vast majority of them, who want to do good. They want to, they're not trying to pander to industry.
No.
They want to make positive change. They want to be doing things the right way. Most of them are very much oblivious to the history of conservation and the ties to some of these things, right? So I do absolutely believe that. At the same time, I do believe that a lot of their decision making and the top down way that things go is informed by industry. And I always say that, like, when it's more profitable to do things the right way for us to survive or to profit off of or whatever, that's when you'll see change. And now we're seeing that happen in real time, because like ecological restoration is now a bigger, there's more money in that than there is in the logging industry.
Oh, interesting.
At least in the United States and Canada, that's true. So, unfortunately, that's how things are probably going to change. A lot of that momentum is going to change because we're at a point where we literally cannot pretend that we can get rid of invasive species, or that climate change isn't happening, or that these things aren't changing. What I would like to see is people come at it from an organic internal place of relationship, and not a place of, well, we can't afford to extract and ruin things that way anymore, so we'll have to move on to a different approach. And so many of these places that are, it feels like the last frontier, not the last frontier, but like the last stand against like trying to keep people industry out, like these like just the work that you're doing with the mining issue that's over there, of like just this trying to, because there's so many instances where there's that last little bit left. Like thinking about like oil drilling and stuff, I know like we're running out of resources to tap, so we're going to keep pushing the limits farther and farther. At some point, that's going to break over, and we're going to have to think differently. So yeah, but I hope that like you're talking about, that there is some discussion about these things, that translates soon. Like we need it to happen sooner than later. It translates into the way that conservation is being conducted, and then that has to translate into the way that common people, the lay people, feel about things, because for so many reasons. It's just not healthy. I mean, it's just not healthy for people to have this kind of mentality about anything. And especially we're literally living through another genocide. We're living through watching this unfold again. And there's so many people that are like, why is this happening? So it's just, there's so many layers to this, but just having the opportunity to see where this is coming from, and then undo that, unlearn that, is a really powerful thing to do. So,
well, and the fact that change can happen rapidly in nature in terms of evolution is something to look to and be like, so that means that there's the potential for there to be rapid transformations in our thoughts and in our culture as well, because there are those people who are just like, oh, this is just how it is, we're stuck like this, or the very worst argument, which is just that, oh, this is human nature, right, which anyone who says it's human nature to be destructive, well, you're just throwing your hands up in the air and saying there's no point to doing anything, are you? And also echoing, Abrahamic religion and its idea of the fall and original sin and all that, I mean, yeah. But so I think I hold out for the possibility of transformation being more rapid and more radical than it seems like it could be right now, given the current climate. But knowing that things can happen, both in the natural world and historically in human events, there have been rapid changes, before.
I think that's like the whole part of like a reason to even try to pick apart a like seemingly black and white contrast, is so that there is room for rapid change.
Right.
When it's like, oh, if we can really just like get that black and white stuff like a little further removed, then it's like you can hear what I'm saying. Like, I think removing the dams and planting in some species that haven't been there in a while is a great idea.
Yep.
I'm totally for those things.
Right.
I'm also for the Russian olive and the tamarisk coming up below the dams and keeping surface water there. Yeah, I'm for all of those things. And you can be too, like, it's not black or white. We can have rapid evolution. Like, if we're not immediately getting so crunchy just because it doesn't line up in this one camp that we've decided we have to be in.
Right.
It's like, I don't want to be in any of the camps.
Yeah.
I love native plants. So however you want to draw the line, I love them. It's great. I love seeing how things come together the way that they can where they are. It's beautiful. Yeah. I'm so glad I'm not in charge in how all of it works. Like, what a job. Oh my God.
Right.
And that doesn't mean I can't enjoy playing with it. Like, I would love to be involved in projects of gathering seeds. I like the idea of gathering the local, types. That sounds cool, but I just don't want to like contain myself to be like, this is the only way it's possible. Like, people are trying to find more and more seeds for restoration, and there's a shortage of where you go and find them. And then people are starting farms to grow the native seeds for the restoration, but they only want to do it so long, because then it'll become too domesticated and they still have to get them from right nearby. And it's like, it becomes a little tricky, and zones are shifting. So I don't know, bring some from the lower elevations or more southern climes up here and find some of the local ones. Like, they're all lovely. Makes a lot of sense. It's okay for us to be approaching these things from an emotional place in our heart. Just be clear what it is. Like, you're doing these things because you care. That's beautiful. I think that's where we see a difference, is actual care, and if we're actually caring about something, we're continuing to watch what our effect is. Yeah. You can
definitely hold space for both. Right. Yeah.
It's not hard. It's not either or, like I've had a lot of sadness and just being like, I just really want to be involved in more collaborative things. And it's just hard. I feel like I haven't been a part of the club enough in order to really do that. There's like a little distrust if I start to speak. I mean, that's not always true, but I've felt that a lot in my career. Like, I gave up a career in restoration because it didn't feel right.
Because it was about spraying.
Because it was all about spraying, and that didn't feel right to me at all.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
Yeah. The issue of herbicide spraying is what brought me to the issue of invasive plants in the first place.
Really?
I was like, what's going on here? Because, I was already into organic agriculture and organic farming. And then to be like, oh, wait a minute, So, I mean, the collateral damage that occurs from all of these different attempts to control is too often ignored, like, you can't spray something without spraying the things around it, like you can't bulldoze just the non-native plants, you can't, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
Yeah.
there's so much irresponsible, not just science, but also irresponsible media representation of
Yeah.
this whole issue. It's mind-blowing when you actually start to dig into it. It really does blow my mind how bad it is. Yeah.
It comes back around to the social perception again. Like that is such a big part of this, you know, because it's like those are anecdotal things that got passed around from some professional with a social perception of animosity or of taking over or competition.
Yep.
You know, and I've heard you know, people who I respect, because I respect people who care and who are trying to see things and speak up for things, you know. But they'll be like, you know, speaking back to the invasive species being a part of colonializing energy, you know. And it's like assuming that like you know, first of all, that all indigenous people as a group have the same perception of new plants, you know, and secondly, that we know what that perception is, you know, that it's not appreciating it, you know.
Right.
And there's all kinds of things that go into that. And some of it, a lot of it has nothing to do with the exact plants that are there. It's removal from ability to be on their homelands, you know, be doing things there, to be interacting, so that that traditional ecological knowledge, where it came from, can be continuing to continue in real time, you know. And I found this, I started digging into that part a little bit. You know, I've had my own experiences by meeting people as I'm wandering around, and there's a lot of different varied opinions, you know.
Totally.
But I found this, it's like a 300-page manual that came out, which was all concerning indigenous perspectives of non-native plants. And I can send it along to you. I just started to skim through it, but they would go through, each chapter was talking about a different, you know, indigenous community in some place in the world. All of them that I started scanning through started with forced removal from the land. And then they're living in the reservation or somewhere outside of that place. And then having some feelings about like, oh, it's gotten really overgrown in here with this new plant. But they already have a name for that plant and have uses for it and stuff like that. And so, yeah, there might be a sadness of grief of it's not like it was, but also there was an adoption that's already been happening too. I mean, that's a part of our integration. You know, it's a really popular thing now to be talking about indigenous people of the land and how we want to be listening to their perceptions and stuff like that. But that perception was a very different context than bad or good. It was a place of integration through changes too, you know. And I'm not trying to speak for anybody on that, just like observing the containers that these things are in, you know.
Yeah.
So like for any of it, having a different perception again would be allowing that interaction, allowing people back onto the land to be forming like what is integration here and now, you know. And that doesn't mean we're not considering what integration with the land was before. Having plants you still want to be taking care of and bringing forward into the future that are traditional, beautiful. But it's probably going to look it's always going to look a little different because we're here now, you know. The same way that, you know, indigenous cultures are different now because we're all living in the same world that has these different aspects going on, that has modernity, that has, you know, information through the cell phone, that, you know, these are all pieces of our perception to greater and lesser extents now, no matter where you're from, you know.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think about being here on this land. How can we possibly like make actual reparations in action? You know, like, I mean, there's lots of ways we can think about that. We can think about the land back movement and things like that. But I mean, like, we're just like, if we're gonna do that, if we're gonna say, you know, that settlers can be, you know, seen in the same light as invasive species or non-native species, which I would argue that there would be more like calling, you know, the African population that was brought here as an enslaved as enslaved people, they didn't come here of their own volition. We certainly don't call them settlers, right? The plants didn't intentionally come here in an act of conquest, although we say that they do. That doesn't happen. But if we're thinking of it in that terms of like, yeah, we're like the plants and we're here now. Just like the plants aren't going anywhere. We can't go back to like, I mean, I wouldn't be able to go back to where I came from because I come from so many different places and none of them would welcome me there. And, it's not an option. And so what is the way forward, right? It's not about what is the way back. It's not about trying to, turn back time. It's about what is the way forward and how can we actually be here on this land and sharing it with the people that were here, the plants that were here before us.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very difficult conversation to have in some aspects because there's so much grief, there's so much shame, there's so many different things that go into that. There's a lot of guarding, I think, on, from different perspectives, and I can totally appreciate and empathize with that, and I know for myself, like a lot of like conflict about what that looks like. But the reality is that just like the plants are showing us how to move into a space and integrate, it's part of, like you're saying, and there are lots of different opinions about this from Indigenous communities, but I've seen a lot of the same thing. They embrace those types of changes. They don't necessarily embrace being colonized by any means, but certainly embrace new plants moving into the landscape and, like you said, giving them names and finding uses for them, and they embrace that. That's from our ethnocentric viewpoint that we think that Indigenous people don't change because we've relegated them to that stasis, to that just the same thing that we do with the land, that they were this thing, they're in the past, they always stay the same.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. They're moving, dynamic, just like everything else. And they're, generally speaking, from what I can tell, much better at it than we are. And adapting to change. The fact that we still have Indigenous people here is testament to that. Yeah. So I think, and again, I always go back to what are the plants showing us? What is the lesson from the plants? And it's how to be here. And as long as we continue to see their energy as colonizer energy, and see things in that perspective and not see all the beautiful ways that they're trying to create relationship and trying to integrate, trying to create mutualistic and symbiotic relationships and co-evolve with everything that is here, we're never going to learn how to do that ourselves. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on this and thinking, am I being defensive of these plants because of my own history and my own, ancestry and stuff like that? Is that possibly where that's coming from? And I really have spent a lot of time reflecting on that. And I think that's something that people should do, reflect on that in general. But what I've come to is that I really just want to be able to be home, to like belong somewhere. And I think that, like we talked about, a landscape cannot sustain any creature that lives on it that doesn't integrate into it. And so we have to be able to do that. Yeah, I do feel a lot of like, I feel like we need to push back against that narrative that plants are colonizers, because that's us imposing our own major baggage onto them instead of allowing them to show us who they really are. We need to stop doing that to plants. It's, and that's one of the ways in which we do that.
Yeah. And especially, I think that if we look at it also in terms of the fact that many of these plants have adapted specifically to human disturbance, right?
Right.
They're good at growing in farm fields. They're good at growing along fence rows. They're good at growing along irrigation ditches. They're used to it. Like that. That's what they've gotten good at. And so we make that. Them coming over here and following us, that's also why they would be good teachers for us, is because they've been dealing with our shit this whole time. Right. So in that way they can be teachers in helping us to figure out how to deal with our shit, and in terms of them being colonizers, this also comes into play, because it's like, well, wait a minute, this is nature, taking a gander at the situation, being like, okay, this particular disturbance that just got made here, where you did a clear cut, or you drained a swamp, or whatever it is that or you put in this road. Yeah, I've got the ones for that. Here they are. You know what I mean? Like, they're fixing it. Like, no, they're not part of the colonization. No, they're part of nature's response to our colonization. I've been really upset to see this narrative making the rounds that, oh, these plants are colonizers too. It's like, no, that sounds an awful lot like trying to foist off some of us onto them, It's like, no, actually, we need to own this one, okay? Right. We need to own this one, and that means not blaming them in that way,
Right, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I just think about the plants I've been following around that I was introduced to, and especially the lomatiums and the Simopterus, those umbels. There's like so many different varieties. And a part of that, I think, is because people were moving around with them, and there is such that connection there that you end up having all of these different expressions of those foods, because they were hanging out with these people over here, and these ones were hanging out with them over there. And we call them different varieties or species now, but I think they probably had some similar roots and kinship made that diversity, and people would adopt new foods that they liked and be paying attention to how they integrated into the landscape. That's how we can call the wilderness an untouched place, not recognizing the deep fingerprints of human interaction. Like the desert, the Great Basin has been fascinating for that. You find the densities where people were hanging out. And you find the densities shrinking when you've removed those people. Yeah. So we don't really know what our perceptions in the response might be if we actually had that reconnection to engagement with the landscapes. I'm sure that it would look different than it used to, but if we wanted to have, like, I love these plants. That's why it's so funny to me that people would maybe assume that I'm saying I don't care about them, when it's like I've dedicated 10 years of my life to just following them, and gathering their seeds and planting them. Like, I'm heavily invested in them continuing, I'm not trying to make it like anything goes. It's all subjective. But if I wanted to be successful in conserving those plants, in helping them continue, I would have to really be willing to understand the relationships that make that possible. And I might not be able to get those same plants on that same hillside if all the water in the water table has been drained somewhere else. I might have to come up with something else. I might have to bring them a little further over there, or have them in the mixture with other things, Like, I've been planting a lot of these plants in cheatgrass patches, because cheatgrass isn't really in the way of them. It's just cheatgrass is growing in places that have powdered soils instead of the cryptobiotic soils, because we've had grazing out there and fire and probably a hotter soil temperature, So how do I try to work with those things, so that I'm successful at continuing those kinships,
Yeah, I wonder how things would look differently if we actually, if the land back movement succeeded and Indigenous people were actually in control and charge of these types of projects again. I have a feeling they wouldn't be spraying, tons of herbicide and, and letting industry in to wreck things. And I think that things would be a lot different.
I mean, some would, though, I mean, this is the thing, is that the survivors are not monolithic,
Right, that's true.
And the people who have been put in charge through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and all that kind of thing, through those structures that have existed, have been certain types of personalities, you know what I mean? And there's oftentimes division, between old school people and then the people who are on the board or whatever. And in Oregon, I remember seeing, some logging that was just really bad that was being done on the Warm Springs Reservation, and there's old growth in British Columbia right now that's being taken out with the blessing of the tribes. And so I think that this becomes a really difficult question, of course, as that it's like, well, okay, does it make sense, what we're then sort of saying then is that it's like, oh, well, it's the decision maker should be decided by DNA,
Right. Yeah, I know you can totally.
Okay, so that's kind of funny, isn't it? Is that, are we sort of circling back to someplace right there, right? Because
right.
I don't have any answers for this at all. That's why this is just what I'm raising, because I don't know what it would look like if land back succeeded. I don't think that I think that there'd still be spray, and there'd still be I mean, currently as the culture is, there would be logging in that, unfortunately,
Yeah. Well, because I mean, the fact of the matter is that everyone here is colonized. Everyone,
exactly.
every single one. As terrible as that is, the difference between the people who have ancestors from Europe is that we were colonized a lot longer ago.
Right.
So I think, it's a really good point. And I also, I mean, that this would be a whole other conversation we don't have time for, but the whole conversation around purity and blood quantum and the issues around that. I mean, and that's, I mean, we know, everyone knows that that's an issue, and we know that it's a product of colonization.
Right.
But yeah, so it really is, it's a matter of what is the perspective, what is the vantage point that we're viewing things from, and what is the action that we're going to take, not necessarily not necessarily saying that one particular group of people has all the answers. Right. I do think that traditional ecological knowledge informs so many of these topics that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But I agree, that's not, like you said, they're not a monolith, and there are lots of different perspectives and opinions and problems within that as well. But I think that at the root of it, it's like we need to, same thing we've been saying this whole time, right, is really observe where did we go wrong, and what better decisions can we make now?
Because the plants, the invitation to work with plants and have relationships with them is being extended by the plants at all times to all people, to whoever's going to accept that invitation and enter into that relationship. And so that's going to be a mix of people across the board.
Mm-hmm. And just like we can't say that we can that fortress conservation mentality, apply that to a landscape or to plants or whatever, we can't apply that to people either.
Yeah.
So if people do want to think of settlers and invasive species from a similar mentality, if that's where you're approaching that from, it's like you can't, we're still here participating and consuming and being part of the economic and ecological structures that allow us to live on a daily basis. So we have to integrate. We have to not just ecologically but socially, right? We have to learn how to coexist, and we have to rediscover what that looks like. Because if we don't, then it's not like, everybody goes down, the whole system goes down. It's not like one, mm-hmm. Certainly there's disparity, and certain people suffer more mm-hmm. than others because of the way that the system is set up. But in the long run, in the big picture, if we don't pull it together and learn how to have these conversations across the board, and honor that everyone deserves to have a place to call home, no matter where their home was in the past, where their ancestors' mm-hmm. homes were, and not go about that through violence. I don't know how, I don't see a path forward for us if we can't figure that out. And again, I think the plants I think the plants have the blueprint for that. They're showing us how you can do that. But because we're imposing our own issues onto them, we're seeing it as a reflection of our own issues. It's exactly, our own problems. Yeah.
I think this concept of home is a really important one, and one thing that we say in the a phrase we've used in the book is that instead of looking at plants in terms of where they're from, we should look at them in terms of where they're at home,
Yeah.
And then everything is explained in most cases, actually. It's like, well, that's why this plant is growing here, because it's at home here. It is at home at a roadside. It is at home below a dam. It is at home, et cetera, right? And so in a similar way, there's kind of a real way in which we're not looking at ourselves as being home here. We're not treating it like a home should be treated,
Right.
And I feel like those concepts are related in some way,
Yeah, well, doesn't oh gosh, his name is escaping me right now. I have his book on my wall right there, William Cronin. He talks about that in his one essay of like, yeah, and this feeds back right back into the early conservation mentality that urban spaces or conserved spaces we don't actually feel like they're home. We don't feel like we're like just residing there, but really home is out in the beautiful landscape.
Right.
And so we have to preserve that because that's our true home. But no, we're not living there. So it's that same concept. It's almost like we're in this state of like, like we feel like we're in this in-between state. We're like, well, eventually we'll be able to make it back home.
Right.
And I know for me personally, like that, I think that might be a product of being, having European ancestor, like not actually having roots in this place. On the one side of my family, my ancestors came here in the right before the immigration reform. So in 1917, it's fairly recently. I don't feel like I've never felt like this is home, but I think that's not like I live here. Like if we were plants, our roots are in the ground, right?
Yeah.
That is your home.
Right.
But because we have feet and we can walk around, I think we feel displaced, like, where we have no direction.
Yeah.
So yeah, I that is such an important thing, is to cultivate a sense of belonging, and no one's going to feel like they belong if they're not interfacing with the land in a healthy way. It just doesn't happen. And you're totally dissociated and not in touch with any of the sources of your subsistence.
Well, do you want to just to kind of wrap it up here? Do you want to tell people who are listening or watching where they can follow your work?
Yeah. So the website is northernappalachiaschool.com. I'm on Instagram. I avoid social media whenever possible, but I am on there. Not on Facebook so much anymore. But yeah, you can definitely check out the website. I always have, all of our classes are listed on there on our homepage, and so if people are interested in learning more about bioregionalism, the focus of the program is herbalism, but we do a lot of, it centers around decolonial practice. It centers around ethical practice and ecology. So if anyone is interested in that, you can check that out and apply. Yeah. But yeah, talking about all the discussion about having relationship with the land and having that direct connection, and kind of just like learning how to do that. How do we even go about that? That's kind of what the program is about.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Sounds great. Sounds like very important work. Thank you for doing it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Well, thanks for joining
thank you guys so
me.
much.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is great. And thank you guys for all the important work that you're doing. And I'm really excited for when the book comes out.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at kollibri.substack.com. That's kollibri.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.